Hello, everyone. Thank you again for stopping by another episode of Alliterations. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the 1961 uh, classic novel by Muriel Spark, a Scottish writer, uh, The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie. So, this book is a rather interesting one. Uh, just basic rundown, basic plot synopsis. Uh, Jean Brodie is a school teacher who has rather unorthodox methods of teaching. Uh, Nothing violent, nothing scary necessarily, but she doesn't really believe in the propriety, the current curriculum as it is. She believes that she knows better. Is basically what it comes down to. And so it teaches the Brodie set, as they're called. It's six girls. They start off their novel at 10 years of age and then progress through the novel throughout all of their years of being taught by Jean Brodie. Uh, so it's six girls, and they are taught by Jean Brodie, as it said in the book, uh, art and religion first, then philosophy, lastly science. That is the order of great subjects of life and their order of importance. That's what Miss Jean Brodie says uh, as she's teaching them. Uh, and so really like to put this work is about ultimately is power. Uh, it's a really interesting work because there's a lot of juxtapositions in it. Uh, Jean Brodie uh, believes believes she acts in an enlightened sense, the philosophical movement of the Enlightenment, uh, and she projects that onto others, whether it's her students or the other school teachers or the parents or whoever. But really, when you get down to it and you examine her actions, examine her beyond her words and more so into her actions, you see that she has a very uh, naturalistic or modernistic sense about her. Uh, it's very primal. She lusts for seemingly two things, power and sex. But then in the end, we discover that sex is really only about power anyways, uh, in the case of Miss Jean Brodie, at the very least. So it's a really interesting novel, and the way she's teaching these girls is to be leaders. You know, she wants them to be, these enlightened leaders like we would think about uh, Isaac Newton or Thomas Jefferson or Martin Luther King or any of these people, enlightened leaders that see beyond, have a great vision for the world, that lead others to lead out, is the Latin translate to education, which was what Miss Jean Brodie claims to be giving these girls. And in the end, she does, because these girls, one of them, uh, betrays Jean Brodie, uh, basing her betrayal off of the lessons that she's taught by Jean Brodie herself. Uh, so, it's a really interesting story and play on words and emotions and actions, uh, and sort of the intermingling of, things are not always as they seem, obviously, but beyond that, things aren't, we like to think of things being separate, these literary movements, philosophical movements being separate, but in this case, we can see that they're actually very much intertwined. Modernism intertwined with naturalism, intertwined with the Enlightenment, uh, and then, like I said, people are not quite as they seem. Uh, so like I really enjoyed this work. It's my second time reading it. I enjoyed it quite a bit more this time than I did last time. I had to read it for college, college course. Uh, but beyond just that, I think that the way we can understand this work is by taking Muriel Sparks into a literal sense and saying, you know, the people who influence you, whether it's the people who take action around you or the people who speak to you, who teach you, they're the ones that really influence your life. It's the people who surround you. Uh, and that comes into play quite a bit in this work. These six girls are very close knit, and they each have their own outlook on things, like we each have our own outlook, but they feed off one another. They dare one another to do things. They uh, inform each other's thought processes. They finish each other's sentences or thoughts. It's a really interesting, it's a really fun way of the way that Muriel Spark writes is actually a really fun way of seeing how a bunch of friends interact, which is one of the things that I really enjoyed about it. And made it a very quick read too, because you're reading through these conversations that they're having, and you're just like, oh yeah, well, I sitting here and I could hear somebody saying those words to me because I've heard those words before. Maybe not literally, but I've heard these types of conversations before in my life. And so, like I said, that's uh, an interesting writing technique. Likewise, this work takes place in the 1930s, so that post-war era, really between World War I and World War II, uh, and more on that in a minute. But the point of that is that we really get to see how the war has impacted people. There are people in this work. First off, there are very few men. Uh, And the reader is not told specifically why that is, but if you understand the historical context of it, you can see that a lot of the men died in World War One. And now it's, 20 years later, 15, 20 years later, these girls are of that right age. Possibly some of their fathers have even died, uh, during the war or right after the war from various injuries. We also see people with injuries. There's a prominent character who has one arm. And, I don't believe it's specifically stated why he only has one arm, but again, one is left to imagine that. And that gives an interesting way of inserting the reader into the story in and of itself. But more so than that, uh, this book is also, like I said, set in the intra-war period, and that becomes important when Jean Brodie starts talking more specifically about power, specifically about fascism. She starts off saying how she greatly admires Mussolini because he gets the trains to run on time. Okay, well, that's an interesting take, but the girls go along with it because you know they're taught to respect a higher power. They're taught to lead and be be active in leading others and seeing the world in an enlightened, quote unquote, enlightened sense, which is kind of what the fascists originally were designed to do, is lead in a quote unquote enlightened sense. Didn't quite turn out that way for obvious reasons. But then more so later on, Jean Brodie starts talking about how she admires other fascist leaders, Francisco Franco in Spain, Hitler in Germany, and all these other sorts of individuals. And this is when, again, not necessarily because of this, but this is when some of the girls start seeing that maybe Jean Brodie is not quite as enlightened or as forthcoming with her beliefs as they might originally have thought. Uh, Likewise, there's a lot of discussion about there's a lot of just juxtaposition between uh, Catholicism and Calvinism. And one of the really interesting things about this, I thought, not being a Calvinist and not knowing very much about Calvinism, but understanding that Scotland, where this is set, where Muriel Spark is from, uh, is a predominantly Calvinist country, society. Miss Jean Brodie seems to have the attitude of uh, probably from her upbringing as a Calvinist of predestination. Well, I'm meant to do these things anyways, and it doesn't matter what the consequences are going to be. It doesn't matter how it will impact others. This is what I'm meant to do. This is the predestination part of my belief system, even though she's not a Calvinist. She just believes in that mindset of Calvinists, if that makes sense. Uh, and so, like I said, this is really fun way of comparing and compacting and conflicting these two a lot of different elements. The idea of the philosophical movements and elements of fascism, modernism, naturalism, and the Enlightenment, and all of their associated movements. Uh, in religious terms, the idea between or the differences between Catholicism and Calvinism, in a more personal sense, the what you're willing to how far you're willing to listen to somebody and how far you're willing to let them continue on with their actions. Uh, and so, like I said, there's a lot of conflict, even though you wouldn't think that the 120-page novel about a Scottish school teacher in 1930s Scotland would have a ton of conflict. There is actually quite a bit of conflict. It's just most of it is sort of under the radar. Uh, Back to some of the ideas of how it's written. I really enjoyed it. It's all set in the present time, contemporary time. But then there are periodic sort of flash forwards that show where the girls ended up and kind of what happened to Jean Brodie and some of the other characters. And that's a really fun way of sort of teasing the reader into saying, oh, well, how did they get there? How did all this happen? And as you read through it, you see all the pieces uh, come together at the end to finish the puzzle, as it were. And then when you reread it, you can say, oh, that's right. They ended up there, but I can't quite remember how they started on that journey. Now I'm rereading it and I'm thinking, that's how they started. And I really liked how Muriel Spark played with those flash forward sequences uh, that aren't detailed, but they're 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 good enough to prod at the reader's curiosity. Uh, so I would highly recommend Primus Jean Brodie. Like I said, the second time I've read it, I enjoyed it quite a bit more the second time. Uh, and I think I would enjoy it again on a third read somewhere down the line. Uh, Anyways, please like and subscribe. Leave comments below. Feel free to leave suggestions for anything that you think I should review. Next month, I am going to review a Truman Capote short story, Miriam, which is a really wonderful short story. I read it just a couple months ago and I really liked it. And I'm excited to reread it. It was that good. I want to reread it again only a couple months later. So, uh, look forward to that. Thank you for stopping by this and watching this episode of Alliterations, and I look forward to hearing from you again soon. Bye.